when it comes to poems, I think some people get very, very intimidated. And I think they get intimidated because some people think back to like high school where maybe they were reading like a Shakespearean sonnet and you're almost like taught that poems are these puzzles to be solved, these mysteries and things like that. Everything's a symbol, and I think these that can make poems become very intimidating for people. Poems don't have to be about that. They can just be about the experience that when you read it, the emotion that you feel, the places where it takes you, and that's perfectly valid. However, for those of you who are writing poems, interested in adding more complexity and layers to your poem, then there are some things that you want to kind of be aware of that can help to enhance the experience for your reader. These include things like stakes, like turns, like irony, like lyric, like narration, like parts of figurative language, like similes and metaphors and things like that. So today we just kind of want to go through what are some key ways that you can find poetic devices in other people's poems, in your own poems, and how can you incorporate them even more to improve your experience. I see Jeff Taylor is here saying this can help my writing. That's the goal. We're trying to help you out. So, guys, good morning, good evening, good afternoon, where you are. Welcome to our weekly poetry show. This is Diverses Live. We're here on Tuesdays. We also have a Sunday show as well where we analyze poems and things like that. But today we're just talking about a poetry related topic as we do on Diverses Live. And today we're going to be talking about how to find poetic devices inside of your own poem or the poems of others. And to begin, I kind of want to start just with the classics. Let's actually just begin by taking a look at a sonnet. We're going to begin with Shakespeare's work. So this is sonnet 29. There's a lot of them, obviously. So pick one that is interesting to you. Let's kind of just read this first. I'll zoom in a little bit, make it a little bit more manageable to see. Okay, so this is sonnet 29, and then we're just going to kind of identify some things that we notice going on here. When in disgrace with fortune in men's eyes, I all alone beweep my outcast state, in troubled deaf heaven with my bootless cries, and look upon myself and curse my fate, wishing me like to one more rich in hope, featured like him with friends possessed, this art in that man's scope, with what I most enjoy, contented least. Yet in these thoughts, myself almost despising, haply I think on thee. And then my state, like to the lark at break of day, arising from sullen earth, sings hymns at heaven's gate. For thy sweet love remembered such wealth brings, that then I scorn to change my state with kings. All right. So I know we get like the Old English and things like that. Maybe you haven't read a Shakespearean sonnet in a long time. So that's fine. It's one of those things. It's kind of like philosophy. Like the more you read it, I think the easier it gets. You kind of get used to the phrasing. But let's just kind of see what's immediately happening. So first things first. Things that maybe you noticed are starting off with rhyme schemes. So the very first thing when I'm looking at a poem, the very first thing I'm trying to identify is let's just kind of see what's the rhythm of what's happening. Right? So let's see, is it even having a rhyme scheme or is there no rhyme scheme? If we're dealing with a sonnet, traditional sonnet, it's just Shakespearean sonnet, it does have a rhyme scheme. Eyes, cries, state, fate. Okay. Hope, scope, possessed, least. Okay. Despising, arising, state, gate, brings, kings. You also have to keep in mind with rhyme schemes that, pronunciation changes over time. But the other thing too with rhyme schemes is, off rhyme. So how closely are the rhymes being used? Let's just talk about things to pay attention to if you are rhyming. So first thing you want to pay attention to is are all of your rhymes like hard rhymes, perfect rhymes, really clear rhymes? If that's the case, that may be something that you want to mix up a little bit. Maybe that's not serving your poem. Maybe it's distracting to your reader. Maybe it would be helpful to use more off rhymes. So for instance, if we look at how we would read this in modern English, where we get a hope, scope, Fate, stay, hope, scope, possessed, and then least. You would look at that. That's kind of stands out as off rhyme, but something like that could actually be helpful. Maybe, for instance, you have a poem that's talking about a relationship breakdown, right? So maybe in the relationship that you're describing in the poem, things go from good to bad. And maybe it has a rhyme scheme, but then as the poem goes later on, that rhyme scheme kind of starts falling apart. Maybe it uses more off rhymes and things like that. This is how I can use form and structure to amplify my meaning. Okay, so that's just one example. It can make the experience of reading a poem with rhyme a little bit less overwhelming, because sometimes the rhymes can kind of just like beat you over and over and over again in the head, and this can make it a lot more manageable when you use off rhymes. In addition to that, what other like poetic devices can we find focusing on rhyme just for a moment? Well, we can also pay attention to when are the rhymes appearing. So we would call this like there's an A, B, A, B, where the like letters they rhyme. So eyes, cries, that rhymes. State, fate, that rhymes. Cool. So A, B, A, B. Then we have hope, scope. So that's C. Then we have possess, D. Then scope again, C. And then D. And then E, F, E, F, G, G. G, G being down here. That's called a heroic couplet when you finish with a 2-line section that rhymes. It's called a heroic couplet. Okay? And that's your typical standard format for a sonnet. Okay, so anytime, that's another little thing. If you see a poem that's 14 lines or 13 lines or 15 lines, I want you to kind of just automatically kind of start thinking, we're in sonnet territory right now. It doesn't mean it has to be a sonnet, but that's something to be thinking about. Speaking of form, what else kind of constitutes a sonnet that you can also apply to your own poems? Well, some other things that you can kind of pull from this. Typically a sonnet, again, you're working with 4-line sections. Group of 4, A, B, A, B. Group of 4, B, C, B, C. C, D, C, D. Group of 4, E, F, E, F. And then your couplet, G, G. Okay. So inside of this measures of 14 lines, but notice that if I group it that way, this is 4, this is 8, this is 12, and then we have our 14. It's not 7 and 7, right? Okay, it's more like 4, 8, 12, and then we get the 2 thing. It's unbalanced. You're basically operating on this section of 8 lines and then 6 lines. It's not 7, 7. Sarah's here. Always good to see you, miss. And I love sonnets. Of course, there's so much. Sonnets are great. I know a lot of people haven't read Shakespeare in a while, but if you get into it, there's so much happening. What's so important of having an 8-section group followed by like a 6-section group? Okay. The reason that's really important is because what happens right here. This is our next poetic device that I really want you to begin paying a lot of attention to. This is what is called, in science, it's typically called your volta, which basically means your turn. What is a turn? The turn is the moment in a poem where everything starts to get subverted. This is the moment of change. This is the next poetic device I want you really paying attention to in your own poems, in your own writing, or when you're reading people's writing, especially for those of you who are interested in publication. If you are trying to get into journals, especially like your tier 1 type journals, your editor, whoever's reading your poem, they are looking for a turn. You may not like it. You may not use turns in your own writing, but I promise you, this is something your editors are looking at. They're looking at your first line. They're looking at your title. They're looking at your last line, and they're looking for your turn. This is part of the kind of the publishing code. What is the turn? Well, to really kind of understand it, we need to understand what's kind of happening in this sonnet, what's going up before. Okay. What's the general mood to open this? Well, in disgrace with fortune in man's eyes. Okay, things aren't going well for me. I all alone. I'm lonely. Beweep my outcast state. I'm alone. No one wants to be with me. In troubled deaf heaven with my bootless cries. I'm alone. I'm lonely. I'm moaning about it to heaven, and heaven's ignoring me too, because it's deaf heaven. And I keep looking at myself, and I'm cursing my fate. I wish that I had more wealth. I wish I had more hope. I wish I was like those people who have friends. I wish I had that one guy's ability to like do art. I wish I had Sierra's ability to do art, right? Um, I wish I had this other man's their scope. And the things that I enjoy the most, I have the least of. Man. But then what happens? So all of this is like, man, my life is in a horrible state. Woe is me, woe is me, woe is me. But then we get this magical word yet. And it's the thing about turns in poems. Turns, they're usually pretty predictable. Okay, a lot of times they're indicated by some sort of a transition word. Like but, however, yet, words like that. These are words that show that we are doing a hard pivot. The other thing that's going to typically occur with these two is where they appear. I mentioned earlier that sonnets are not 7 and 7 balanced, that they are 8 and 6 balanced or imbalanced, right? And that's really important because typically your turn does not appear in the first half of your poem. Okay, it doesn't appear typically before then. It almost always appears in the final third. Almost always appears in the final third of a poem. That is your kind of textbook place for a turn, because if it's right in the middle, that's too soon. It's like too perfect. It's too on the nose. It's too balanced. Okay, so very often your turn appears in this final third, and that's what we get here. What happens? Again, we've been kind of beating ourselves up through here. Then we get to the yet. In these thoughts, myself almost despising, haply I think on thee. And then my state, like to the lark at break of day. So we get the sunrise from the sullen earth. Now we're getting songs. We get heaven's gate. For thy sweet love remembers. Like, oh yeah, I'm not actually alone. You love me. Oh, isn't that great? Yeah. Such wealth brings that then I scorn to change my state. I no longer want to be like a king. I am in a better position than kings. That's what we get. Okay. This is the power of the turn. So the next thing you want to be looking for in your poems in terms of poetic devices, you want to be trying to find where is the turn in your poem? Where are things changing? Either inside of your poem, for your speaker, things like that. Okay. One of the ways that we've indicated it with the transition word. We've indicated it thematically. You know, we're getting the brighter images like the dawn. We get the hymns. We get words like happily, things like that. How else? Also, just in terms of rhyme scheme. So we've introduced new rhymes. You know, we got our EF rhymes, and then we're finishing with the couplet. So structurally, we're changing a little bit. You can even just look at the poem visually. Like, if we let me bring it back. If you look at the poem visually, a lot of times you can detect the turn as well. There's some things structurally that are happening in this final third that haven't happened elsewhere. We get these parentheses. We also get the indent over here. So structurally, just visually looking at a poem, you can also start to identify that there's some things that are different in this portion of the poem than what came before it. So these are some things that you want to be considering when you're trying to identify turns. And also just kind of structurally, I think it's really helpful when you write a poem, you know, zoom out enough where you really can't even like read it anymore and just look at it visually and ask yourself, does this visually capture what I need it to capture? You know, this is probably the next poetic device. This kind of is in relation to form. I would say like visual form. I don't want to say like we want to make like a concrete poem. Like if you're writing about a tree, make it look like a tree necessarily. You can certainly do that. You don't want it to be too gimmicky. But for instance, a common strategy, like if you say you're making a poem about the wind, you know, a common strategy you hear is that, oh, well, if you're making a poem about the wind blowing, maybe your poem starts really calm with just like a gentle breeze. So everything's kind of in a block. But then as the wind gets stronger, maybe you start, you know, moving your lines around the page a little bit more. You start adding some spaces between words and things like that to make things feel a little bit more scattered. Just like wind kind of like moving leaves and things. So this is the next kind of poetic device. I would say give your poem the eye test. What does it look like visually? Is it doing things that can amplify the message of what your poem is about? Okay. So that's the next thing I would say. Always give poems your eye test. Look at it visually. Have it do some things. The next thing I want to talk a little bit about is something called stakes. Okay, if you haven't heard about stakes before, maybe like a poem does not need to have stakes. But have you ever read a poem that maybe was just an observation? It was just kind of like writing about the things happening around you, but there's no real reason to continue reading it. Like you finish reading it, and you're like, oh, that was nice, and then you go on. Nice poem, but not much really to kind of come back to. That is an issue that is having issues with stakes. Give me one sec, guys. Our co-host is here, so I'm going to go get him, and then we'll talk a little bit more about stakes. Give me about 2 minutes, and we'll dive right back in.
Facts are important, but like emotional truth that poets get at is the most exciting and like maybe the most truthful.
When I read it in this space, when I bring it to this audience, why do I want to do that today, here, now? Something I think I'm doing a lot in my work is giving a certain amount to be able to see where this boat is going and where the waters are taking it, but not trying to paint the full landscape. Not only because I don't want to share it, but because I don't know if even I want to go there yet myself. So I'm wondering how you handle that, and if it's scary at any points for you, or how you deal with that scariness.
Yeah. Well, first, so do you feel that way about Cruel? God,
yeah. I mean, a very common reflection I get from my work is, people are like, I don't know exactly what's going on, but I feel a lot of things. And that's kind of a lot of just my passion in art. Like, I don't always want to know exactly what's going on, but when I apply it personally, and I'm willing to approach what I'm willing to approach in the manner of which, or the manner and depth in which I'm willing to go into it,
Yeah.
And we talked about this too, it's a long game of poetry, right? Things I'm tapping into now with Cruel, I surely will keep writing about, and surely I hope that, not that I'll reveal more, but that I'll discover more.
Yeah. I mean, I feel like I asked because I feel like I recognize that in the book, but there was an intentionality behind it. I'm thinking of a specific moment that I marked. This stood out to me when I was reading. You said, I offer a puzzle that will madden you, but your ego feeds differently. I liked that itself as an offering of the text as a puzzle and as an offering, because I think even if there is distance that you're feeling and some fears about sort of, is this text?
All right. Thank you for your patience. Hi, Matthias.
Hello.
Our co-host is here,
man.
How are you today?
I'm doing great, man. I'm doing great. Actually, I was running like a little bit late. I was like having a meeting. Actually, I'll tell you that after this poetry associated meeting with stuff pending, but some stuff coming up soon. So I'm actually really excited about it. I haven't gotten the opportunity to tell my co-host about it yet. So like I'll tell him, and then maybe I'll tell you about it next Tuesday.
That's what's up.
But
we'll get to it.
But this has been a good day.
And Jeff says hi.
But you're Jeff.
Dude, this is Jeff with a J.
Oh, Jeff with a J. Which one is the prime Jeff? Which is the prime Jeff spelling?
I mean, Jeff Chaucer is very early in history. I'm just saying.
Man. Sorry.
Just saying.
Sorry, Jeff Taylor.
Just saying.
Sorry, Jeff Taylor poetry.
Yeah, so our topic today, again, we're talking about how to find poetic devices in a poem. We've talked about looking up rhyme schemes. Yeah. We've talked about turns a little bit. The next thing we're identified is we're going to be talking a little bit about stakes.
Delicious.
Yes. Especially this one. So here's a poem. We were actually talking about this. So we have a group called the Poet Business Institute. So we're helping poets kind of organize themselves, find ways
shout out
to
Poet Business Institute.
Unfortunately, I changed some things. So unfortunately, our buttons didn't work.
Imagine that there was a round of applause slightly
a thundering
in the audio,
thundering
just now.
applause.
That's the button that I wanted to happen for you.
Yeah. Yes. He said you spelled Jeff with a J. That's fair.
Huh?
No, he was saying
He spelled Jeff with a J.
Yeah.
He doesn't spell Jeff with a J. I actually met over the weekend because Ajane's birthday was on Sunday.
Yes, happy birthday, AJ and A.
Happy birthday, AJ and A out there. They're doing the Versus podcast like right now. So,
Oh, really? Okay, cool.
I don't know if I was supposed to give that information.
No.
I don't know if I'm supposed to know it, but I do know it. But
Gotcha.
but yeah,
so really quick.
but yeah, we actually met somebody. We did this tour for her birthday of the Kelton House on Kelton. It's like this really old colonial home that's been like kind of redone to be a museum. But our tour guide was named Jeff, and Jeff was a G.
We're everywhere. We out here.
Yeah, so
Represent.
yeah. I don't know, Jeff with a J. You gotta bring one more person so you can at least
some competition out here. All right, so like I said, our next poetic device, we're going to be talking a little bit about steaks. It can be a complicated topic to discuss. Like, if you had to describe steaks to someone besides using the word delicious, how would you describe steaks?
Okay, I was about to say like describing something that's at stake, but that's what being able. Oh, stakes are like the elements that there are to lose or gain by a decision or a circumstance in the selection. I would say.
Yeah, I mean, a common thing. I was, again, a member of our pub business too. I asked them, okay, so like you have a job. Why do you go to your job? He goes to job to get paid. Okay. And why does he get paid? He's like, well, he has to pay rent. It's like, why do you have to pay rent? Because if you don't pay rent, then you lose your apartment. Okay, and what happens if you lose your apartment? And then you're homeless. And so it kind of keeps going on this spiral. And then if you keep going long enough, you start getting into kind of like these almost like primal sort of things, like, oh, like hunger or like shelter needs or security needs or like a status needs or, you know, or like identification needs, like trying to avoid like cognitive dissonance and stuff like that. So these are layers of stakes. You can kind of think of like Maslow's hierarchy of needs. It can kind of relate to that. So the stakes are those implications, you know, if something doesn't happen that the speaker wants to happen, then how does that affect the speaker? Or if something does happen that the speaker, because it doesn't always have to be negative, you know, it could be positive thing like, oh, if I get this new job, I can finally afford to do this one thing. You know what I mean? So like, it doesn't always have to be a negative sort of consequence. So one poem that we looked at in the Institute was this one. This is Basho haiku. It's one of my favorites. So in Kyoto, hearing the cuckoo, I long for Kyoto. And one of the things that we kind of talked about with this poem is that if you take off the last line, like if you just say like in Kyoto, hearing the cuckoo, in a lot of ways, a lot of poems that I read online are kind of doing that, where it's pure observation.
Yeah.
Pure observation. Sure. Like I'm in Kyoto, I'm hearing the cuckoo. There's the wind. The sun is shining on the water. You know, it's like a lot of times what happens is you get these like really nice, happy, pleasant, or like sad, you know, down images, but it never really answers the question of so what or who cares.
Yeah.
You know, so it's like, well, what is the significance of these things?
Yeah, and it's often because they're describing things that are either not. Mundane is not the word, but a lot of times it is mundane. But a lot of times they're describing things that because of their circumstances don't really present a clear and concise like risk or something to be risk averse. So you're not really describing, you know, a situation that the speaker has to navigate. You're just speaking to an observation that the speaker's observing.
Risk is huge because I think it's we are naturally risk averse, right? Because taking risk means that you can lose. And if you have the choice to not take a risk versus taking a risk, like if you have something that's safe and secure and like you feel confident you're going to get it, why would you risk that? So
Yeah.
I think putting yourself in a position to be vulnerable is a risky move. So I think it can be easy to kind of stay at that, I don't want to say superficial, but that layer where you're not feeling the need to kind of peel back. But the problem with that is by not diving into that layer of vulnerability in writing, you're not giving your reader anything to kind of latch onto for themselves.
Yeah. Yeah, and a lot of times, like the beauty that you might have, or the beauty which you might be like entranced with, like whatever you're describing, a lot of times like that's not gonna have the same appeal as like the risk of that beauty. Like, is there something that's happening because of that beauty, or is that beauty is there a risk of that beauty like being erased or something of that nature? So, yeah, and I think it's kind of like a levels thing because it's like I don't think that simply describing something is like a non-factor that's like that automatically makes your poem like not good, but adding a risk will always transform that into something that like you have to like you have to revisit, right? Because now you're like, man, like how do you feel about losing it? How do you feel about gaining it?
Yeah. So tying this into this poem, so if we just have this line, in Kyoto, hearing the cuckoo, again, there's not really, it's like, okay, there's some sound, which is nice, and there's a place. So, it's very concrete, so I can be there, but I'm not going to come back to this. Like, it's like, why do I care about any of this? But then we get the last line, in Kyoto, hearing the cuckoo, I long for Kyoto. Well, now we've just upped the complexity to a much, much higher degree because now we get the emotional state of the speaker, and it also is complicated because we're in the place, and yet we still long for the place. And so now, in the span of 3 lines, we're playing with emotions, related to like nostalgia. We're playing with desire. We want something with the longing, but the thing that we desire we can never actually get because we're physically there and we're still not able to escape the longing that we have.
Yeah. And I think it also because it presents an observation which is typically like kind of a singular layer because unless you're describing something that you are using some kind of like metaphor to elaborate on, like you're dealing with a kind of a single layer of observation. So now you have this single layer of observation that is now made complex and multi-layered. So now you're like, I long for Kyoto, like now the speaker, like now I have to assume like it's the speaker somebody who used to live in Kyoto and now this person is experiencing Kyoto in some kind of different way and they're longing for Kyoto in some other fashion or for what it used to be. Maybe they like had their own cuckoo bird, right? Who know, like, you know what I mean? Like, it just, I think it introduces like a level of complexity to the speaker that now you as the reader have to put on in order to really understand the poem, or maybe you don't understand the poem and that's the reason why.
It kind of reminds me, there's literally, I think I told you about this, like in Japanese there's literally a word for when you go to Paris and you're disappointed because Paris doesn't live up to, because like I guess like historically in Japan,
anybody
like,
who's in Paris right now that's listening to Jeff say that, I think you have an impressive city. I think it's great. Eiffel Tower, what? How big is that tower?
Also brings up my favorite story about the Eiffel Tower. That one dude that like hated the Eiffel Tower when they made the Eiffel Tower, and then they finished making the Eiffel Tower, and the only place you could find him was in the Eiffel Tower, like at the top. And you're like, wait, if you hate the Eiffel Tower, like why are you here? He says, because it's the only place where I don't have to see the Eiffel Tower.
Where is it? You're in it.
But yeah, there's literally a word because again, it plays with this idea of it's not even nostalgia because like it never really existed, but it's like this idea, the idea of something being better than the actual thing, right?
Yeah.
Like you romanticize Paris, and then you go there, and it's like it's how can it ever live up? It's like the same thing like in your own childhood, like you have like a favorite food from your childhood, but every time you come back to it, it's like yeah, I mean it's still good, but it's like you're still hunting for that first original taste, you know. And I think this poem from Basha really kind of captures that sense, which I think in a lot of ways this is also very comforting because he's able to add, in my opinion, a high level of stakes with 4 words. Four words. That's all. It took him 4 words to completely change the entire poem. So when we're trying to add stakes to a piece, we don't need something that's like super super dramatic or anything like that. It doesn't necessarily take much to add stakes to something. It can be complicated to arrive at the right words to take you there, but it doesn't necessarily have to. The final product doesn't necessarily have to be much. To up it.
Yeah, I was thinking about it like if you have like a mechanism, like what are they like throwing a wrench into it? So like essentially you have this entire working functioning like clock tower, and maybe you're like this is a working functioning machine and everything's going as it should, but there's not really anything else there except for the mechanism, and then you like throw a wrench into it, and like it might something small, like you know what I mean, like if you're like a wrench versus this machine, like the machine should win, but if it's strategically placed, it could disable the entire thing. And I think that's what I mean. Naturally, disabling in this context would make it. This is the thing that made this interesting. This is the thing that turned it on its head and made you actually have to do some work around the selection, because you're not just thinking about the bird, you're just not thinking about the reader or the speaker being in Kyoto. You're thinking of this longing for Kyoto which adds a lot of other connotations to it.
Yeah.
Not that I've ever thrown a wrench into a clock tower ever before in my life, so do not charge me for that.
It was not me.
It was.
It's very unfortunate it happened, but I hope you find the person.
Now it's not going to be ringing every single night. Let me get some sleep, why don't you? But again, was not me.
I think it's interesting with stakes too, because a lot of times in poems that I read, the lines that involve stakes, we can look at another poem that we were looking at earlier was a sonnet from Shakespeare, but a lot of times the lines that incorporate stakes incorporate like emotional language, like longing. In this case, like I long for Kyoto. Everything else is really concrete. In Kyoto, place. Hearing the cuckoo, so that we get sensory. But then we get the I long. And I think that a lot of times when you read poems, there's, especially like if the poem's been, heavy concrete, but the one moment where like the speaker lets on about how they actually feel can be really, really powerful. And I think it kind of contrasts with that idea of like show versus tell.
Yeah.
And sometimes it can be like, oh, but I'm supposed to show it, but not tell. But that doesn't. There are moments where telling can actually be really, really effective. Going to the Shakespeare sonnet.
Big Bill Shake.
Yeah,
that's what we used to call him back in the day.
Big Shakes.
I never thought he would get around to writing poems.
Here we are.
He just had a weird hat.
All these centuries. Did he have a hat?
He had a hat for sure.
His hairline was like
atrocious.
Like LeBron James would have loved it. So we talked about. I think stakes and turns are often connected. A lot of times, the turn is the moment where the stakes can So I know we have a little spike there. So in, in these thoughts, myself almost despising, right here. This is the moment for me right here where the stakes become clearest.
And then state.
So basically, I know you just jumped in with us. Yeah. This whole first half is just him being like, my life's horrible. I'm jealous of all these other people. Everyone else is really great.
Classic.
I'm not. Yeah. And then, in these thoughts, myself almost despising. So I'm about to hate myself. But then suddenly, I think about you. And then I'm getting there's hymns. And then there's like sweet love, and it springs. Such wealth brings. So suddenly I realize that I do have wealth. Okay, so by thinking of you, I actually realized that I do have wealth. I thought I didn't, but I actually do. So this is kind of the moment right around here where the turn happens. This is where, for me, the stakes become clearest.
I would agree with that.
To the point where I don't even want to change my state with a king. Yeah. Other things that kind of stand out to you about this one? Yeah. I know it's hard to just throw you into a sign. And of course, guys, as your arena sign too, if there's other things that we haven't mentioned that you notice about the sign that you think would be helpful, we're again trying to find poetic devices that can help you in your own writing.
Yeah, I think these two lines, the pairing of these two lines, because I think the with what I most enjoy contended least. Like I think about like that with the next line, yet in these thoughts myself almost despising. Those two lines are the pairing that have like the almost like the yin and yang of the of the stakes, right? Mm-hmm. Because now you have him giving you the like essentially summing up the rest of everything we saying was just like, hey, with the things that I enjoy the most, with the things that I most enjoy, like these things are like the least of these things.
Yeah.
But all these other people, they have these things that I wish I could embody. And then in the next line says, yet in these things of myself almost despising. So he's essentially saying that I'm almost there. And then the rest of the selection we have like this what he does have and what he's cherishing in that regard. So I think that we're kind of presented with the stakes in those two, because the stakes are probably somewhere lined up in the middle, where it's like, would you rather be this person without the rest of the selection, or the person that you are without all those other things?
Right. Yeah. You can see in that one line with the wishing and then scoring to change my state. Yeah.
Yeah.
All right. So those are a number of different poetic devices to be considered. So we talked about stakes, we talked about turns, we talked about rhyme schemes a little bit. We talked about just visualizing a poem, give your poem the kind of the eye test to see what your line breaks are doing and your form looks like. What are some other poetic devices that you think are helpful for poets to incorporate or identify in poems?
Incorporate? I would say being able to develop a use of meter.
Okay. Oh, let's talk about meter since we literally have the sign,
which is longer than a yardstick.
This is so good to know.
That's just if you ever wanted to
imperial versus dimensions. Yeah. So that's another thing. If you're a poet that is using rhyme, I strongly encourage you to study meter, because I think it can be frustrating to look at a poem that rhymes that's not using meter, because it's just we could just rhyme at any old moment that we want. It's like, I'm gonna use blue because last time I went shopping I bought a nice pair of shoes. It's like, wait, what? It's like, man, like how are we getting here?
I think I mean, because you can be so much more inventive than that, and I think like as opposed to just being like, well, at the end of this line, it has to rhyme at the end of this line, and the end of this line, and then you know what I mean. Like, and those to be clear, I'm not trying to take anything away from those, but I think much more interesting rhyme schemes kind of develop throughout the course of lines as opposed to just showing themselves at the very end, because then it feels like you were like trying really, really, really hard. And sometimes it comes off like that. Like, man, this line does not make any sense, but it has the rhyming word at the end.
Yeah.
So
and then a lot of times it doesn't even pass like the eye test. You'll get like these really weird line breaks. Like, it's like people were entirely thinking about performance. They weren't thinking about how it appears visually on the page at all.
For sure.
So if you're new to meter, Shakespeare can be helpful if you're willing to dive into it, because
Big Bill.
he's usually operating on a lot of iams or trochees. But so what does that mean? So we're talking about like some very standard patterns are either doing like da 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 da. That those are iams. Like when you do like da da, it's like weak, strong. Da 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 da. The opposite of that is a trochee where you're like da 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 da. And you can probably hear there's a different like force with those. You know, if you're like da 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 versus da 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 da. I mean, trochees tend to be very strong, impactful, punchy from the start.
Yeah.
You know, because you're kind of starting with the hammer, whereas like iams kind of just like lull you into it. You know, I think one of the things you see with meter is that it doesn't necessarily. You can have an over kind of arching meter, but that doesn't mean you have to like follow it perfectly. If you follow a meter too perfectly, it kind of can start sounding a little bit robotic.
Yeah.
And you see that with the science as well, where it's not perfect meter. It's like when in disgrace with fortune and men's eyes. But that's probably not how you would actually read it. But like if you were just going for like straight meter, that's probably how you would think about like when in disgrace with fortune and men's eyes. But if you actually read it, not being so robotic, you'd probably be like, when in disgrace with fortune in men's eyes, probably something more like that, right? So, so when you're thinking about meter, it's okay to be like do like the super regular mechanical, but you also want to kind of be thinking about how would it actually sound being read, because if you're like when in disgrace with fortune in men's eyes, I all alone beweep my outcast, that like that's just, it's just. You start not even hearing the words, you just hear like the rhythm, and it can be a little bit distracting. That being said, I think it is important. I think it's important even if you're not rhyming to think about what the meter is of your poem, because whether you're rhyming or not, you're using a meter, because English is a stress time language, so you're going to have this stuff happening whether you want to or not. So if it's going to be there, why not be intentional about it? You know, like, so for instance, we talked about the difference between like iams and trochees. Like if I have a poem that I want to sound very authoritative, very angry or something like that, I might use a lot of trochees. Like no, do this, like things like that. That's very heavy.
Yeah.
You know?
I think about it even with just like kind of regular dialogue. If you're writing like one of the things that I'm doing is like just like with some like short film stuff, but I'm carrying a lot of the things that I use in poems with like dialogue, especially if it's dialogue that you want to present as like especially meaningful, because you know, if you ever watched a show that is like really highly regarded for their dialogue, I think about like the first like 4 or 5 seasons of Game of Thrones, right? So the first 5 people lauded that show over its dialogue, and it's because there was a musicality to their speech. You know what I mean? Like, so even not just like the words, but also how the directors are in, and I'm sure the actors are, you know, interpreting how they are to be spoken. And so you can't have, you know, a line of dialogue that if it's coming from, let's say, somebody that's like of high authority, like a nobleman, and they're speaking to somebody who is in their world, like kind of like a lower kind of person, like either a peasant or something like that. Like the tone and the temperament, it's not going to feel timid. It's not going to feel like they're afraid or they're like kind of skittish. It's going to feel very authoritative. And you can convey that in your poems as well. That way you kind of give some voice to the speaker. without necessarily having to voice the speaker.
In fact, you can even have different characters use different meters.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
Oh, you know what is a really good example of that? I think because it's like the 22nd anniversary, I think it is, of The Wire. And
It's wild, it's that old.
it is. We're old, man.
If it were a car, it would be an antique, isn't it?
It's so crazy, man. It's nuts. I just so like this past Friday I celebrated my 33rd birthday, and like, dude, okay, well, I don't want to. Can I hear it?
That works.
Oh, nice. Okay, good. So, I celebrated my 33rd birthday. This is a brief non sequitur. We're gonna get right back to it. I promise you. But, we went to my friend, Paige's house. No, not for my birthday. On Sunday. No, on Monday. I'm tripping. It was yesterday. I celebrated my 33rd birthday on Friday, but on yesterday for the holiday, we went over my friend Paige's house, and like a whole bunch of family was over there, and I raced 3 different times. I break full sprint 3 different times. And I won all 3 races. And so if there's any...
What did it cost?
I projectile vomited like 3 times. Like afterwards, it was freaky. And mind you, it was...
did you really?
I'm so serious. It was really bad.
Everything.
It was really bad. Because I had just got done eating all the food. It was a barbecue and everything. So I'm like, all right, now let's just all race. And so like, that was really bad. But it's all circling back around because I remember watching The Wire like when I was a kid, like when I was much younger, right? And so I remember the dialogue, and I remember because it's like it's an interesting it's interesting kind of what you realize when you're older. Because therein it's like it's a lot less clear as far as like the levels between people. Like you have to really pay attention to who would be considered like the boss of somebody, who would be considered, because like in Game of Thrones, like you could probably look at their clothes, you could look at like their rank, if like they're wearing like the arms and stuff like that, you're like, oh, like this person is higher up than this person. But everybody there, they're dressed in relatively the same kind of clothing and garb and things like that. But so often kind of how you are to perceive those characters, it's coming through in the dialogue, right? If it's not, even if it's not like intentional, like, you work for me, all like
right.
They're not necessarily saying that directly, but the way that they're speaking, the way that they're conveying like this dialogue, it's like you can tell, oh, this person knows, this person is higher up, this like and things like that. And it was just a brilliant way to convey dialogue, and I think that's something that again I try to carry with me in dialogue and scripting myself, but just also additionally like in your poems, because if I have a poem where the speaker is if the speaker is supposed to be like a timid kind of lowly like person, like you don't want to use I would say like not even just language, but like the ways that your lines are paged can really convey something different than otherwise, because man, so many people's so often your writing is what's going to give that away, because it can actually give it away on accident. Like you might be like, I want to write this like this character that feels incredibly small, or like the speaker in their poem feels incredibly small, and they're looking to branch out, but like because you don't feel like you are that way, you can't write that character, or you can't, or it's kind of preventing you from being able to write that person, because like you just can't get into that frame of mind. So really kind of digging in and kind of taking this kind of stuff, so it's like you have to be really intentional about it. Like after you've gotten done writing the poem, now ask yourself those questions, kind of look at the meter, look at how these people are delivering those poems, and like, man, would this person speak with the menial kind of like, man, like I'm at the lower totem pole, I'm trying to like work my way up, I'm building this confidence, with that person speak in a domineering, quick paced like tone, or would that like how would that person kind of come off a little bit timid? And I think that like those are the contextual things that like I think split a poem being kind of well written to a poem really like blowing you away, because you're like, oh wow, like I am well within the grips of this poem. I'm not just taken there because of the person's words, but because of how they're speaking, I can really get a sense of the speaker.
I think to build on that, so word choice is really really important, because no two words have exactly the same meaning. So when you're choosing like synonyms and things like that, or when you're choosing your speaker, so like deciding, whose eyes is the poem being viewed from, and what's the language that they would use. For
Yeah.
instance, if you're writing a poem, easy example, like if you're writing a poem with the speaker being like a 5-year-old, that should sound very different than a poem that's written from a speaker who's like 80 years old, you
Yeah.
know, or the speaker who's like from the inner city versus like a speaker who's from another country, like, things like that. All those things, have a massive impact. And I think the other thing you need to consider with this too is also the audience. Okay, so the next poetic device is, I think, is, it's not really a poetic device, but I would say maybe a poetic consideration is who is the person that you're writing for. Because if you're writing a poem, I'll give you an example. Like right now, I write a lot of like dad poems. So that means a lot of things that I'm referencing. I'm thinking about what are some experiences that if parents encounter this, they would be like, oh yeah, totally, I'm there. Whereas
Yeah.
like someone who maybe hasn't had kids before, hasn't interacted with kids much, may not. There's still things they can take from the poem, but there's going to be things that they aren't going to fully be able to capture, and that's okay. I think that writing the poem for everyone in a very general audience is not a very wise decision, because no one's going to be able to actually enter your piece. We want to actually, ironically, the more individual and specific you go, the more universal the poem's actually able to apply. Um,
Yeah.
I think a lot of people have this idea, I want to write poems for everybody. When it's like, even if I'm aiming for like this tiny little mark, I'm throwing a single stone into the river, this one specific spot in the river, the ripples from that are still gonna go wider than that, So you'll still hit other people, even though you're focusing on a single group. So once you know your audience, that can also dictate some of your word choices. So if you're like, oh, like if I'm academic, but I know that my audience maybe consists of people who, haven't read much, haven't spent a lot of time in school, maybe just have had a very different experience than I've had, then if I use the wrong word choices, they're not even going to read my poem.
Yeah.
Like we have to. So we're kind of balancing, the speaker's perspective, but also thinking about the specific audience. Like, what do you know about your audience? Like, what if you had to give like 3 sentences about who your audience is? What would that look like? And that can change for every poem, but these are things that you also want to be considering, because that determines the choices you make.
Yeah. No, 100%. Permission to use an analogy.
Granted for the moment.
Yes. Okay, so there is this show on HGTV, right?
This is
And
not going the way I thought it would. Wow. All right.
it's like the button, like watch it.
All right.
Okay, there's a show on HGTV where essentially they go into somebody's home and like they learn some stuff about the person, right? And then the person goes away on some like trip or something like that, and then they renovate this person's house. Like they crazy renovate this person's house, and then like when the person comes back, it's like their home is like renovated and customized and done all this crazy stuff for this person, right? And I think about that when like kind of writing poems, because essentially they have to know, like, the producer, whoever it is that's doing it, they before they do like this interview with the people, they know about their, and they have to write in. So like of course, like whoever in the family or somebody in the family, they write in, they tell them, like a lot of times it's like maybe they have like a family member that's disabled, and like go kind of telling them about like, oh, this is what they really like, they really like superheroes, they really like this, and so like then they like customize the entire house, and like it's decked out and all this other stuff, but they put a lot of time and energy, resources and research into customizing this person's home. And what's really cool is that like I'm sure that if somebody that, like, let's say like again, one of them was the kid really loved like DC superheroes like Superman and stuff like that, and so like they kind of customized like this like chairlift thing, which is really cool because they needed like a chairlift for like the stairs, but they customized it to kind of look like Superman kind of flying, right? Like kind of going through the house. And it was like so cool. And it's like you can appreciate the artwork even if you don't have to use that stuff. Like I personally, there's a lot of stuff in that home that's like customized for them that I don't necessarily have use for, but I can appreciate the craftsmanship that goes into like the building of this home. But if they came in there and it was like, I just want to make well, the way the house was before, right? The way the house was before is like it was a house that anybody could live in. It wasn't necessarily specifically appealing to this family or to their family member that kind of needed some of this stuff. It was just a home that was a really nice home, right? And everybody could appreciate it, but there's nobody's gonna hold it in a special regard. Now now they have an audience of like this person. And then people like this person are gonna hold this house in special regard. They're gonna be like, "Wow, this is an incredible place to live." And it felt like if you're a superhero fan, like the Watchtower, like that's what it was. They wanted it to kind of feel like where all the superheroes hang out and stuff like that. The space station, and so essentially that's kind of they use that research in order to construct this space, and it was just so cool because I'm like, yeah, like when you think about it with your poems, it's like, man, like they were able to build this incredibly intricate world for this specific family that specifically could use it. And yes, like maybe my poems are, I'm like in Jeff's example, like in your example, like your poems are like dad poems, and so you're thinking I'm writing dad poems, and so typically people that are close to that scenario, like maybe other dads are gonna absolutely resonate with it. Maybe there's like partners of those dads that are like, oh, yeah, that reminds me of my husband, my like the other dad that I know, and or maybe like there's like people that are like young enough to like, or not even young enough, but like they're just maybe have a closeness with their dad, so that like maybe like they're really globbing onto these things. But then maybe there's an area outside of that where people that can just appreciate the construction of the poem and can appreciate that it's tailored to this audience, and it just goes out further and further from there. But if you're not willing to, I think, commit, then you're gonna risk. Well, we talk about risk, right? You're gonna risk making something so general that nobody can really hold it in a really, really special regard.
Yeah.
Shout out to HGTV. If you want to sponsor Diversus Poetry, just bring us on the show. Build a house that is specifically for poets, and then we'll live there. Okay. We'll do it.
So again, lots of the things there on like register, word choice, things to go throughout. Let's maybe kind of wrap up maybe like one or two more poetic devices to kind of keep an eye out for in a poem. I guess one thing I would say is let's get into the figurative language stuff, the metaphor stuff. Again, for those of you maybe, I feel like most people are familiar with like simile and metaphor, but in case you missed it, so similes, we're talking about comparisons. Similes being comparisons using like or as, like tall like a tree. Metaphors, again, I'm going with Francine J. Harris's definition of metaphors, comparing without the use of like or as to unlike things, like adding in, it's not just comparison without like or as, but the things themselves are unlike. And so we get some examples of similes here. It's like featured like him with friends possessed. The similes here are a little bit different because they're more general, like a friend, like trying to be like him, like a friend or someone who has friends, basically. Wishing me like to one more rich in hope. Probably your more imagistic simile would be like here, like to the lark at break of day, arising from sullen earth. Okay, so like because my state, how I feel, is like a lark at break of day arising from sullen earth. Okay, so things like that would be examples. So
What do you prefer? Do you prefer metaphor or simile?
metaphor all day. It's
Metaphor all
simile.
day.
Similes just feel weird. The problem with the simile is that it can never be the same thing. It's like it, but it's never the same thing. Like I don't
I
want,
get that.
I don't want like $1 million.
I want it to be.
Like I want, you know what I mean? Like I don't want like something that's like the thing. Like, oh, get that car. It's just like a Ferrari. You're like, no, I want the Ferrari. You know what I mean? Like, no, I want the other one.
Jeff is just going onto the car line like, yeah, don't give me one that's like a Ferrari. Give me the Ferrari.
Like I don't want something that's like the thing. I want the thing. Like it's by its very nature, it has to be weaker.
Yeah, I mean, I think I also I prefer metaphor, and I think it might actually be the same reason, but I think I think about it a little bit differently. I just think about it like it's almost like I'm breaking the fourth wall to explain it to you, because you know what I mean. Like if I'm inside the moment, then it's just like, man, like this, maybe you know somebody gave me this prized possession, and it was just a regular pen, but that pen was like, you know, a treasure chest, like, right? So it's like, it's not, if the pen was like a treasure chest, it's like that means I'm like, oh, like this, let me kind of describe to you guys what this pen is like. But the pen is a treasure chest, so I can stay right inside of the moment. And I'm like, I'm still understanding as an audience member that like, oh, like this thing is so valuable, it is a treasure trove, right? And so I just like, I think it's like, it feels like breaking the fourth wall in order to explain the value or like what something is.
I think the other thing too, like what I like even more than anything is probably the extended metaphor, because I think a lot of times you see this a lot with fiction. Like it can be hard going from poetry to fiction because poetry is so condensed and it feels so intentional. And I think sometimes you read fiction and you don't have that same sense of intentionality.
Yeah.
With the words that are given. And I think like sometimes like you'll see like these similes that don't really fit with anything else. Like you'll have this like, you know, very serious like detective novel, and then it'll say like he opened the door, like the doorknob was like a wet sandwich. I was like, wait, what? But like that, like you just completely took me out of like the whole scene, you know? Whereas you want things that are going to fit the poems. Like, it's like, to give an example, if we go back to like the sonnet, we see a lot of things with relation in sonnet. So this is kind of the connection of the other device, would be kind of like extension of metaphor. If you use some sort of, like, if you use similes or if you use metaphors, not just like use it and then leave it. No, like how else, you know, if I throw in one boat image, oh, maybe I need to throw in a lot more kind of naval sea images throughout the poem. And it starts to add a kind of more layers of complexity potentially. Yeah. So like for instance, in this poem, you know, we get fortune. There's a lot of like wealth things, and there's a lot of like heaven things. So like deaf heaven, bootless, like don't even have boots. That to me kind of harkens back to like the fortune sense. We get like rich, other things, so like again, like hymns, heaven's gate, wealth, kings and states. Like there's a lot of consistent word choices here. Like there's everything kind of feels like it fits. There's nothing that feels like, oh, that was that didn't fit the other things. Like, you know, it's not like we have a random one that's like talking about like again, there's no like ship images here. Like everything's kind of like, you know, earth, fortune, wealth, things that are relation to wealth and things. Everything kind of feels connected in that regard. So I think when you're picking your similes and your metaphors, you want to be thinking, does this fit thematically with everything that's come before it?
Yeah, like, and I think that like picking things within like a thematic or like theme, I think it can actually really help kind of developing of the rest of the theme, right, or the rest of your poem, because of the fact that you're not taking the person. Again, if it's this, what was it, like a detective, like you said, like it was like kind of opening the door. It's like, because I'm not taking you outside to like a sandwich. Now you have to think like, because in poems you're thinking that, because it's concise, like you're thinking everything has to do with something, so they can't give me this sandwich image without me needing the sandwich image. And maybe like you're thinking as the writer, like, oh wait, that like the sandwich has nothing, like don't think too much about the sandwich. The sandwich is just a descriptor, but like if the sandwich is just alone as a descriptor and has nothing to do with anything, then like you've injected the wrong descriptor, because now it's like everything in this poem should mean something.
Yeah, it may have been better to not even use figurative language at all.
Yeah. Or I mean because again, you're a little bit more limited with poems, because I think like even in that example, like a detective opening a door and the doorknob feeling like a wet sandwich. Like I think about it like what if you're writing a character, like you're writing a detective who is like this like overeater who's always thinking about food. Now like there's a context that you're like, if he touches something, the thing that's registering in his mind is something associated with food. But again, you don't always have that kind of luxury in poems, or you very rarely have that kind of luxury in poems where you have enough time to give that kind of context and still be able to kind of give without needing like a prequel and a sequel to explain things.
Any final device that you would tell people to kind of look out for in poems?
I don't know if I would call it a device as much as I would just say it's like a consideration. I think when you're writing from a first person point of view, just being careful not to, I guess, maybe always write yourself as like the good guy. And this is just something that I've learned from the experience of like watching some of my own, like a lot of my earlier poems as well, but like just a lot more just like kind of watching poets kind of struggle with like how to make their work more interesting. They're trying to figure out like, man, I want to turn this corner. I want to like write some like interesting work. Like what do I want to do with that? And I think a lot of times being able to like tell somebody that, you are too closely connected with the speaker in all of your poems. And because you're closely connected with the speaker in all your poems, then your description or your portrayal of their flaws are always colored by like the fact that you have insecurities. So like you might be like, well, I can't have this kind of insecurity, or the speaker in my poem can't have this kind of flaw because I'm insecure about that dynamic. And so like they don't have that kind of flaw. They can't carry that kind of flaw. Or if they do have that kind of flaw, it's actually like a good thing. And you see it a lot with like people kind of describing like romantic relationships, where it's like you're reading a poem and you're like talking about this like failed romantic situation that the speaker was in, but the speaker is like this entirely good person. I always cared. I was always so this, and you could only do this, that, and the third. And I want to be clear, like that can be entertaining to do. I personally like I think the dynamic that I write to the most is like satirical. Like I'm almost, a lot of the poems I'm doing is like either making fun of myself or making fun of like somebody or something, or making fun of a scenario or a situation. But I think a lot of times if like people are doing the serious route where they're like, man, I want you to feel the weight of this, then a lot of times the weight of something is much better felt with like an insular description, a dynamic, because like the speaker doesn't even know entirely what somebody else was thinking and feeling and wrestling with, right? But they might be completely familiar with what they are thinking and feeling and dealing with. And I think just like a really good tool, or something that would be really good, that's really good for writers to kind of carry, is just this thought that, talking about their experience and talking about the world from the speaker's experience, as opposed to the speaker giving commentary on other people's, quote unquote like, you know, feelings or dynamics, I think is always more, it's infinitely more interesting to me, I would say. So I don't know if you would feel the same way, but
Yeah, I think people, just from a lot of poems I've seen online, I think there's this assumption that the speaker is always reliable, which is a real problematic view because no one is reliable. Everyone has these unreliable characteristics because we're human. And so I think it's really interesting in your poems. So the last thing I would say when you're looking at your poems, look at like your descriptive words, especially like your adjectives and your adverbs. Like if you're describing something as beautiful, there is no objective beautiful. We are conditioned and trained to view things as beautiful. So understand that your speaker has also been trained to view that certain thing as beautiful. But what they view as beautiful may be different than how other characters view things as beautiful.
yeah.
And I think sometimes we lose sight of that. And so, and that's not necessarily a problem. We don't need to, in our poems, like explain why we find some things to be viewable, to be beautiful. But we also need to understand that we have characters in our poem. Our characters have flaws, and they can very easily project characteristics onto others. I think it can be troubling seeing poems that have multiple characters that have interactions with each other. Very often only show from one perspective, and then that one perspective where we are kind of just held to assume that one perspective is correct or right, when there's always going to be other sides to this story. And this kind of gets into issues with all kinds of art. You see this with photography, you know, where it's like, or you see it with film, because the thing that you choose to capture is also, it's a decision. You made a decision. Yeah. Decision literally means you cut away at something. So like what you choose to show is also what you choose not to show. Yeah. And people generally, we see social media, we generally choose the thing that's going to portray us in the best light, you know?
Yeah.
And I think with poems, you often get these situations where we also, for self-preservation, for biases, for, you know, just kind of like the defense mechanisms of our mind, we make decisions to portray people really positively, or to avoid mentioning the things that might actually be more meaningful and impactful for the poem, even if they sacrifice that kind of pristine view of the speaker.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think, and when you bring up photography, I think that's like another thing that, I guess I do like short films too. So, but like when it comes to a lot of my photography work, especially with like some of the like more like kind of creative shoots that I'm able to engage with, yeah, you're absolutely right. Like if I have, you know, if I have this entire space and, you know, I'm taking a picture, I'm actively choosing what the composition is. And so I'm actively choosing like, okay, what do I want to be in this picture? Where do I want the things that are in this picture to be in the context of the picture? And even when you're editing, you're doing the same exact thing. And I think that because you're making those decisions regardless. So now just try to understand the reasons why you're making those decisions. And as soon as I think like that's another key thing, because like as soon as you realize like, okay, why do I write this kind of poem? And is it because I'm running away from, you know, something in particular, or maybe like I'm writing all your friends are fake, like oh my god, I don't want to say oh my god, like, but you're writing all the friends are fake, and you just got to stand on your own 2 feet because everybody around you is whack, and you just got to be the Lone Ranger star of your life and stuff like that. Now, you could be writing that because maybe that's how things are, but perhaps you're writing that because of like maybe a couple failed relationships and friendships and things like that have happened that prompted you to think that way. And now ask yourself, like, are you the common denominator? Are you like the factor that's like, I think it's happening? And I'm like, that right there is a infinitely more interesting poem. Being like, man, what am I responsible for, or again, just kind of introducing stakes, like, like how long can I carry on the practices that broke up these friendships until I don't have any friends, right?
Yeah.
So it's like there's so many other ways. Again, just reverse engineering your understanding of the reason why you write those poems can create much more dynamic poems.
Yeah, I think, much like with film, if you view your poem as like a movie, understand that there's an additional character. The additional character is the camera man, because the person they're making that decision of what's being shown, and it's like, yeah, you have your speaker in your poem, but there's also even that kind of also additional layer going on.
Yeah, because why is the camera looking at you? Yeah. Like what is the, you know what I mean? So
yeah,
that's good stuff. I feel like I'm always telling like the characters that I'm working with, or the actors and actresses that I'm working with, like, okay, the camera's not here, but like the camera is here,
it's
right?
It's really hard because it's like you can't, with art, you literally can't take that element away.
That's true.
Like you literally, because something has to be portraying everything.
Which is the reason why, if anybody tells you that reality TV it's not real, okay? Because that is not how they would act if the cameras aren't there. Because you cannot, like...
There may not have been a script.
Observation is an element therein. Mm-hmm. So it's like, because you're being observed, because me and Jeff are on camera right now, we're probably talking in a way that, like, I mean, we talk to you guys, but we're talking in a way that, like, maybe we wouldn't, like, necessarily talk, like, all the time, right? And so it's like, that's the element of being observed is absolutely, and it might be, like, a lot stronger than lighting or setting or anything like that. Like, it's like you're just being observed. Like, that could change the dynamic of a great movie.
It's like that physics part. I forget the name of it, but you know what I'm talking about. Like, that they can't measure it because every time it measures, it's unreliable or whatever. And like, I forget if you guys know what I'm talking about. This is a real thing. Like, they can't measure it because every time they measure it, it does something different.
But that's why I told my physics teacher when he gave us a test, I was like, I can't do this.
But then they stop observing it, and then it does something else. And so then they observe it.
Schrodinger's cat.
That's, it's definitely in like the quantum physics realm. Okay. I don't think it's quite Schrodinger's cat-esque, but like it's
okay.
Yeah.
Well, I just threw that out there because my friend Schrodinger has a cat.
All right.
I didn't know if that was a real thing.
All right, guys. Some things happening this week, and also upcoming soon. So if you're in Columbus, by the way, we are going to have an episode any century of time. I think it's the Saturday of the Arts Festival, so not this Saturday, but the next one. I think it's like somewhere between 10 and 2, I think. But I'll double check for that. Matthias and I, we're going to be on stage at the Arts Festival. We're going to be talking about things you want to be considering when you're performing on stage.
Yeah.
We'll just do a podcast version of that. So be sure to check out that if you're in Columbus at the Arts Fest. Additionally to that, this week, Thursday, we'll be taking author photos. We have Photo Thursday at a downtown location. And then Friday, we have our own open mic at Throwaway Cafe at 7 p.m. for the doors, and then 7:30 for the show. And then after that, there's The Nest this week.
The Nest is this week at the Lincoln Cafe. You should come through.
Yeah.
The show starts at 9. Doors open at 8.
Doors open at 8. If you're trying to get on the list, you probably want to be there early.
You gotta get there early. Because people pack in.
How many people do they usually do for the open mic now?
Man, a lot. So
is he bringing in a feature this
there's
week?
There's a guarantee. I don't think there's a feature.
Okay,
but there's a guaranteed 12 people. So, like, to be clear, there's going to be a lot more than 12 people that sign up. So if you are interested in reading and getting on the open mic and performing, then the goal should be get there early.
Especially if JG doesn't know you.
Because I'm performing, okay? I'm gonna be doing it. The question is, are you? But definitely get there as soon as possible. Again, and one of the things I really like is that it's 2 open mics on one night.
Yeah,
right. It's 2 open mics on one night, different time windows. And I think it's really cool because we actually had somebody for, I think, the last Nest that was at
It
at
happened. Yeah,
Diversus,
they come to
and they're
Diversus.
like, "Where's the Nest? I want to go to the Nest." And then whenever I'm at the Nest, I'm like, "Hey, y'all should go to Diversus every Friday because it's like this, but like at a coffee shop, and then nothing like this." So
It's definitely more intimate. I've had people be like, the Nest is kind of scary because there's a lot of people.
it's okay. Here's the thing. It might be public
If you
speaking.
go from like our show to that, and you've never been to an open mic, that's a difference.
Yeah, I think that like the energy is different because I think that because everybody's like a lot more packed in, and there's like a lot more noise outside of the like that's
There's a
when
lot of
when
energy.
people aren't speaking and stuff like that. So it's like really really kinetic, and what I really love about like kind of like the difference is that at Diverses it's like, man, like we're having this like real connection, and you're having a connection with the audience at the Nest as well, but I think that like you're having this like really like kind of intimate space, and then at the Nest it's like, you know, you're having this like really like family ruckus kind of space, which is also really cool. We love the writing, we love the performance at both, man, and the Nest is going to be really great this Friday. Diversus Poetry is going to be really great this Friday.
Cool.
And taking photos on Thursday is going to be really great. Let me tell. Okay, so I'll say this. So like this Thursday, I'm going to be coming as well, and like we're definitely going to be doing some photos. But here's the thing. Here's what's really dope. Last Thursday, we met with another artist, and we were kind of working on some stuff.
She was actually here earlier.
Oh, she was. She was here
earlier.
Yeah. Shout out. But some stuff coming on the way for that. That I'm really really excited about. But man, that's what I really enjoy about what Diversus does and really engages with, that you don't really experience across the board with like a lot of other kind of like I would say like poetry brands, right, or poetry associated brands, is that like it's kind of touching all of the corners of kind of the poet's kind of life and culture, right? So it's like, man, if I'm a poet in the city and I'm really trying to build things up, it's like I have a dynamic of a show that's going to enable me to kind of the cornerstone like with an audience, and so you have this this space that you really can kind of engage with that. You have, you know, podcasts throughout the course of the week that touch on like writing, that touch on like poetry experiences and stuff like that. You have the photo sessions, the author photos, that honestly, you know, don't just come to one. So I think that like one of the really cool things is that you should probably have a good amount of those kind of ready to go. You know, different outfits and different kind of things, because again, kind of getting your face out there, getting some really official and professional looking photos is like really, really, really important. And just like kind of working on some of the poetry video stuff is like also really important. So man, like I think that it's like, it's just really cool because Diversus is not just the show, it's not just the podcast, it's not just the production of the video, it's not just the instruction of how to kind of build your poetry business. It's like all those things like throughout the course of like your typical week.
That's the goal.
And that's like that kind of consistency, that kind of like, oh, it's not just Diversus. We don't just care about your author photos one time in the quarter and then, you know, see ya in 4 months. It's like it's a regular kind of engine for all those kind of stuff. So shout out Diversus. I'm not gonna push the clap because that doesn't work. But bang, just for you.
Cool. On that note, guys, we will see you all later. Hope you guys have a good night, have a good day, have a good afternoon. What's more, my name is Jeff.
My name is Matthias.
We will catch you guys in the next stream. You guys